Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy, where today we will review Unit 1 from the AP Government Redesigned exam. And I want to dedicate this video to my Rho Kappa Social Studies Honor Society stuck in quarantine. Hang in there, guys. So Unit 1 is titled Foundations of American Democracy, where we will look at some of our must-know concepts, foundational documents, and Supreme Court cases that have shaped the government that we have today. Again, this video is just a review of the material covered in this course. If you're looking for more detailed overviews, I cover the material in much more in-depth videos. So one of the major themes of this course and our government is the balance that must be reached between governmental power and the rights we have as citizens. And one of the first skills we will need to demonstrate is to be able to explain how democratic ideals are reflected in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, both of which are included in our list of 10 foundational documents you will need to know for your exam. So let's start by defining those democratic ideals again, all of which fall under the category of limited government, which is pretty much what it sounds like, the concept that governments should not be all-powerful, such as some of the absolutist governments that still existed in Europe at this time. Beneath this umbrella of limited government are the concepts of natural rights, popular sovereignty, republicanism, and the social contract. So for those of you using my study guide, which I placed on my homework page and on a link beneath this video, fill in your definitions for these ideals. So for natural rights, we are going to use John Locke's definition as rights that are God-given or based on natural law that all humans should have regardless of governments. Locke famously stated that governments were created to protect life, liberty, and property, words that we will come back to. Our next ideal is popular sovereignty, which literally translates to people power. Or better yet, that the people are the source of government power. Next is the social contract, which is the concept of an unwritten agreement that the people enter into with their government in which they give up certain rights in exchange for protection. Okay, so most of you have been learning about the Declaration of Independence since you were little kids, and we covered it in detail in class. But remember, what your test wants you to be able to identify is the concept of popular sovereignty in this monumental document. As we discussed, Jefferson borrowed heavily from John Locke, and you can pause this video to look at the comparisons, but again, today we're just trying to look for popular sovereignty. So Jefferson hints at popular sovereignty when he writes about the right of the people to quote-unquote alter or abolish their governments if they break the social contract. But it is these words, that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And it's here that we see that concept of popular sovereignty, that governments get their power from the permission of the people. Well, at first, the people weren't willing to give the central government too much power. After all, most of the Declaration of Independence is an attack on King George III, and many didn't trust a strong central government, which is demonstrated by the Articles of Confederation, our nation's first constitution, and another on our list of foundational documents we need to know for the exam. In this, the states had most of the power, and the national government was extremely weak. Now, it's those weaknesses that the AP will want you to identify. The most glaring is that the national government lacked the power to tax. A government without money can't really do much. The Articles also only provided one branch, a legislature. So while they could make laws, they didn't have another branch to enforce them, which is the second big weakness. After all, enforcing the law is what the executive branch is tasked with doing. Well, the turning point after the Revolutionary War was an event called Shays Rebellion that we looked at. And again, this was an uprising of ex-soldiers who returned to find out that their farms were being foreclosed on. After all, states did have the power to tax. The problem was that the national government didn't have any money to pay for a military since it didn't have the power to tax, and thus could not stop this uprising. And you can use this as evidence of that weakness of the Articles of Confederation and as an event that showed the need for a new constitution. The following summer, the Constitutional Convention was called, originally with the task of just fixing the Articles of Confederation, but that plan was quickly scrapped. As the gathering proceeded, there were some things that everyone agreed on, such as the creation of 3 branches and the power to tax. But there were a lot of things that were hotly debated issues. For instance, many in the North and South held different views on the slavery question, and the small populated states were worried that they might be overshadowed in a new, more powerful central government. So what your test really wants you to focus on is the compromises that were reached at the Constitutional Convention. As you can imagine, deciding how to elect a president, which sounded a lot like a king, was very contentious. And the pressing question was, should the largely uneducated people decide? The compromise they came up with was the Electoral College, which is a pretty complex system for choosing your nation's leader, and one that we will take an in-depth look at in an upcoming lecture. Possibly the most important compromise was what was fittingly referred to as the Great Compromise. Large states wanted a 2-house legislature based on population, while small states wanted to have an equal voice as they had under the Articles of Confederation. The Great Compromise created the U.S. Congress we have today, a 2-house legislature with the Senate based on equal representation making the small states happy, and the House of Representatives based on population making the large states happy. Kind of. Having a 2-chamber legislature is known as bicameralism, and this works as a check on the lawmaking process that we'll look closer at when we get into the 3 branches. As far as slavery was concerned, the South wanted slaves counted to increase the number of representatives they had in Congress, which would also impact the number of votes they had in the Electoral College, again to be continued. The inhumane solution to this horrific practice created the bizarre 3/5 compromise, which would count each slave as 3/5 of a person towards a state's population for the purpose of determining how many representatives they would have in Congress. Finally, a compromise on the importation of slaves was made, which would allow the practice to go untouched for the next 20 years. So, yeah. Because of all the debates, and knowing that this document might need revisions in the future, they included an amendment process in Article 5 of the Constitution. The amendment process demonstrates the concept of federalism, which we'll be looking at in a minute, in which Congress proposes an amendment with a 2/3 vote. Now, technically, there is another way states can propose amendments, but it's never been used, so we'll stick with that whole Congress proposing them thing. Step 2 is the states have to ratify amendments by a 3/4 vote. So we see the national and state governments working together to create amendments. As the summer drew to an end, it was time to sign the new Constitution, but a few delegates refused, foreshadowing the ratification debates that would follow. 2 camps broke out, the Federalists, who were in favor of the Constitution, and the Antis, who, you guessed it, were against it. They feared a powerful new central government would infringe on the people's liberties, and preferred most governing be done at the state level. 3 men, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, wrote a series of newspaper articles called the Federalist Papers to convince the people or the states to ratify the Constitution. And you're responsible for knowing 4 of the Federalist Papers, 2 of which we'll look at in a minute. So our next benchmark is to explain how the Constitution provides a quote-unquote blueprint for a unique form of political democracy in the United States. We will be analyzing the Constitution throughout our course, including some clauses today, so I'm not going to do a big overview of the document now, as we will continually come back to the Constitution as we cover our content. One concept found in the Constitution is republicanism, and again, that's one of our foundational ideals. Republicanism means a representative form of government. Remember, unlike ancient Athens, in which citizens voted on laws and policies themselves, which is known as direct democracy, we elect officials to make those decisions for us. So our founding fathers created a representative government, or a republic, with the Constitution. And there are some today that continue to put forth this idea that America is a republic and not a democracy. I'm not sure if they're associating republicanism and democracy with the political parties, but the argument can definitely be made that we certainly didn't start out as a true democracy, and maybe that we aren't one today, although if you look at the People's Republic of North Korea, it's hard to argue that we aren't a more democratic republic. But you will see this debate in our must-know, quote-unquote, forms of representative democracies, and the debate about how much power the people have. These forms are participatory, which emphasizes a broad participation of individuals in politics; pluralist, which emphasizes group-based activism by non-governmental interests to influence public policy; and the elite theory, which emphasizes a limited participation of the people in politics. So when writing your FRQs, you definitely want to be able to provide examples of these forms. And for participatory, you might want to accentuate the role of voting and supporting candidates. And there are definitely more examples of the participatory model at the state level, including state referendums, which allow citizens to vote directly on laws, and in some states, amendments, as well as ballot initiatives where citizens in some states can get laws or policies put on the ballot by gathering enough signatures. Finally, at the local level, some town hall meetings allow citizens to vote on ordinances or local laws themselves. The pluralist model emphasizes the large role that interest groups, like, say, today's NRA or the AARP, play in influencing laws and policies, as well as political parties, both of which some would say drown out an individual's influence in our governmental system. The elite model holds that the true source of governmental power is monopolized by the wealthy. And you could point to lobbyists, expensive campaign fundraisers attended by the rich, and I often point out one of our must-know cases, Citizens United versus the FEC, which created super PACs allowing individuals to give unlimited funds to candidates, presumably to receive political favors. So, which model of representative democracy is most accurate? Well, our benchmark wants us to be able to identify the debate of participatory and the more quote-unquote filtered pluralist and elite models in both the Constitution as well as our must-know foundational documents Federalist number 10 and Brutus number 1. So let's start by looking at the examples in the Constitution, starting with the elite form of representative democracy. The first would be the Electoral College. In this system, it is actually electors who vote for the president, and technically not the people. These electors, as Alexander Hamilton said, would be made up of men most capable of analyzing the qualities of an ideal candidate. Now, today, most electors are required by state law to vote for whoever wins the general election, but the Electoral College was definitely put in place to protect the elite in case the people chose the wrong candidate. Another example of the elite form of democracy in the Constitution is that U.S. senators were originally chosen by state legislatures, which were often dominated by the wealthy. And it wasn't until 1913, with the passage of the 17th Amendment, that the people were able to vote for U.S. senators. So what are some examples of the participatory model in the Constitution? Well, despite electors filtering our votes in the Electoral College, the framers did allow the people to vote in general elections for our president. But your most obvious example is the House of Representatives, the only part of the government originally elected directly by the people. Sometimes called the People's House, it was given a 2-year term, which James Madison said would make it dependent on the people. So we definitely see participatory model there. Okay, the second part of our benchmark is to identify the debate over forms of representative democracies as laid out in Federalist 10, which made the case for a strong central government, and Brutus number 1, which outlined the dangers of a strong national government. And Federalist number 10 addresses the pluralist model and the controlling of factions, which Madison saw as inevitable, but claimed that a large republic with diverse competing interests would balance each other out. Brutus number 1 argued for a more participatory model by stating that governing for the most part should be done at the local or state level, where the closeness of the people to their leaders would give them more influence. He argued of the benefits of a small decentralized republic and the dangers to personal liberty from a powerful national government. Brutus focused on the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause as providing quote-unquote uncontrollable power for the national government. Well, in the end, we know Madison's argument would win out. But the power of the national government is still a source of debate today. In Federalist 51, Madison argued that the Anti-Federalists had nothing to fear, as he laid out the protections provided by the concepts of separation of powers and checks and balances. Checks and balances is the concept that the three branches can prevent or check the other branches from exerting too much power. And separation of powers is the concept that by listing specific powers of each branch in the Constitution, no branch will have too much power. We will cover the checks that each branch has on the others in detail in our next unit on the three branches. But the most obvious that AP Central placed in Unit 1 being the power of impeachment, aka Congress's ability to remove an official from office for committing high crimes and misdemeanors. While some federal judges have been impeached and removed, it has never happened to a president. 3 presidents have been impeached by the House of Representatives, which requires a simple majority vote, President Trump being the most recent. But all 3 were found not guilty by the Senate, which holds the trial and requires a 2/3 majority to find them guilty. AP Central provides 2 examples for you to consider in our ongoing debate between central powers, state powers, and individual rights. The Patriot Act after 9/11, which allows the government increasing surveillance powers on American citizens, as well as the federal government's intrusion into education, a responsibility normally reserved to the states, and one I go over in depth on my lesson on federalism. Which brings us to our last section for Unit 1, Federalism, which is about the distribution of power between the national and state governments. We have a lot of different names used to identify national powers, which include expressed, implied, inherent, and delegated, but it's easy to remember state powers are always referred to as reserved powers, and powers shared by both levels of government are called concurrent powers. Reserved or state powers comes from the 10th Amendment, which states that all powers not delegated to the U.S. government are reserved to the states. However, we will see that it's not that cut and dry. There are 3 constitutional clauses and 1 amendment that impact this balancing act. As we have mentioned, the Supremacy Clause makes the U.S. Constitution and federal laws supreme over state laws and constitutions. The Commerce Clause, which gives Congress the power to regulate interstate trade, has been increasingly used over the course of our history as a way for Congress to address a wide range of issues, and we will have a Supreme Court case that will demonstrate that in a minute. And the 14th Amendment, passed after the Civil War, which will play a big role in our upcoming lesson on civil rights and liberties, says that no state shall deny due process or equal protection of the laws to its citizens, giving us a concept called incorporation, which makes the Bill of Rights applicable to state laws and policies. Of course, no constitutional clause has had a greater impact on federalism than the Necessary and Proper Clause, aka the Elastic Clause, as it has stretched Congress's powers to pass federal laws on a variety of issues. that may have gone farther than the framers originally intended. Two of these clauses face an initial challenge in our must-know case McColloch versus Maryland, when the state of Maryland passed a tax on the Bank of the United States. In the ensuing Supreme Court case, in the ruling, Chief Justice John Marshall defended Congress's power to create a national bank, citing the Necessary and Proper Clause and the Supremacy Clause as a reason that the Maryland tax was unconstitutional. In essence, this case confirmed the legitimacy of these two constitutional clauses, and for the time being solidified these powers of the national government. So federalism has evolved over the history of our nation, and in the early republic, both levels of government pretty much remained sovereign in their own responsibilities, and this is known as dual federalism, sometimes referred to as layer cake federalism. However, starting with FDR's New Deal in the 1930s during the Great Depression, the two levels of governments have increasingly worked together in what is known as cooperative federalism, or marble cake federalism, as the responsibilities have been kind of mixed together. So how does the federal government get the cooperation of state governments to implement their policies? Well, through money in what is called fiscal federalism. The money provided by the federal government to the state governments is known as grants in aid. And there are two types that you need to know: categorical and block grants. Early on, federal money usually came with mandates on how the states were to spend that money, and these are called categorical grants. Recently, however, the federal government has moved towards block grants, which are to be used for a general purpose, say healthcare, but provide the states with much more flexibility as to how they will spend that money. One method of federal policy being implemented by the states that has come under criticism has been what's called unfunded mandates, which are national laws or policies that states are expected to carry out, such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, but don't provide adequate, or in some cases any money to do so. Well, over the past few decades, most noticeably starting with President Reagan, there has been a push to return power back to the states in a process known as devolution. And this has included reducing unfunded mandates and providing more block grants. We see this shift towards devolution in today's last must-know Supreme Court case, U.S. v. Lopez. In 1990, the federal government passed a law known as the Gun-Free School Zone Act. The rationale for prohibiting guns near or at schools was that it fell under their power vested by the Commerce Clause. Well, the Supreme Court found the law unconstitutional, as possessing guns was not an economic activity. In essence, giving that responsibility of controlling public safety back to the states. We will look at more Supreme Court cases that have changed the relationship between the federal and state governments when we get to Unit 3. But for now, that's Unit 1. So hang in there, guys, and get ready to ace that AP exam. And once again, thanks for watching.